Other than the residents of Jackson County, Indiana and its surrounding area, no one had ever heard of the Reno Brothers. It wasn't until the events of October 6, 1866 at this location that John Reno, his younger brother Simeon, and longtime family friend Frank Sparks would pull the first peacetime train robbery. Newspapers across the country would report how the Adams Express Company was robbed of more than $15,000 in money and jewelry that was headed for Cincinnati. On that rainy Saturday night, as the O&M train was leaving from the Seymour depot, John and Simeon Reno moved through the passenger car to the Adams Express car by means of the running boards. They entered the car and put revolvers to each side of the messenger's head. He gave up the keys to the smaller safe, and they took everything in it. Unable to open the larger safe, they pushed it out to the side door, pulled the bell rope to slow the train down, and jumped off. Frank Sparks would be nearby, holding the horses for them to make their escape. The messenger signaled the engineer to stop. A route agent on the train returned to Seymour and took a force of men back to the scene of the crime, finding the large safe intact. In just 15 minutes, the Renos would go down in history for committing the world's first peacetime train robbery.
One of the misconceptions about the Renos is that they pulled off this first train robbery, and therefore they have this incredible place in history, and that particular event has overshadowed everything that they did over especially a 15, 16, 17-year period when they were involved in so many different criminal activities. This was organized crime at its finest, based in southern Indiana, and their tentacles went well beyond Indiana. It went through the Midwest. Associates of theirs were in Texas, went to New Mexico. At least one of their associates ended up with Billy the Kid.
I had received some email correspondence from one of my friends. They had asked me to do some research for them, and the friend had said, well, I've got some family members who may be related to some train robbers. So, well, what train robbers are you talking about? I never heard of that after having spent my, entire life pretty much in Indiana. And she said, well, the Reno gang. And I said, who are the Reno gang? So I started doing some research, and I started looking online to see what I could find, and there was very, very little information. There were some books, there were some movies that had been made back in the 1950s.
In 1955, RKO Pictures made Rage at Dawn. Said to be the story of the Reno brothers, turned out to be a generic Western, using the Reno name and a fictional character played by Randolph Scott. Historical inaccuracies abound. Most notably, 59-year-old character actor J. Carroll Nash played a 20-year-old Simeon Reno. Shot in Columbia State Park in California, it did little to match the terrain of the Midwest. The next year, 20th Century Fox announced they would make a film titled The Reno Brothers that would stick closer to the true story.
Out of the great Southwest comes the sensational adventure of the notorious Reno Brothers and the girl they fought over.
And it would introduce Elvis Presley in his first film. When the advanced sales of Presley's song Love Me Tender reached 1 million, the studio changed the name of the film to the song title and altered the plot to showcase Presley. The story begins when the Reno father Wilkerson, then only 11 years old, settled with his family in Rockford in 1813. Rockford was located approximately halfway between Indianapolis, Indiana to the north and Louisville, Kentucky to the south.
The Renos, like so many people in southern Indiana, came from Kentucky and before that, Tennessee and Georgia. The Renos pretty quickly became established members of the community by the 1830s when Wilkerson started hitting adulthood, started making a name for himself, not always a good name.
The largest settlement in Jackson County was Rockford, a very small village that really doesn't exist now, but it was about 2 miles north of the present town of Seymour. They had a pork processing, they had newspaper, doctor's office. They had basically, making it a small town, about 900 residents prior to 1850.
Rockford was the town in Jackson County, located right on White River. It had access to barge traffic all the way down White River.
In 1835, Wilkerson journeyed back to Kentucky and he meets Julia Ann Freyhofer. They returned to Rockford and were married.
When they settled, he went back to Kentucky to get a wife, quote, unquote. That was the pioneer type of courtship. When he got a wife, the wife was Julia Freyhofer.
In the marriage between the Reno parents, between Wilk and Julia, you really had conflicting personalities. You had Julia, who came from Switzerland, fairly prim and proper and very religious, the type of person who tried to stay on the straight and narrow and definitely wanted her kids to do the same. And Wilk was nothing but a hellraiser. In the 1830s, there are several instances where he is arrested for public drunkenness, for fighting in public, causing a public disturbance. They just didn't seem to mesh particularly well. But boy, it must have been an interesting marriage from day one, with him being the wild child and she being the Swiss Miss.
My mother was highly educated, but my father was reared in the backwoods of Kentucky. There was no opportunity for him to get any education. He was actually illiterate. I saw very little of boys my own age, for until I was nearly 7 years of age, I hardly knew what it was to have any other playmates than my brother Frank. Our home was like a prison to us, and when away from its restraints, we felt so lighthearted and free that we scarcely knew how to act. John Reno, 1879.
John and his older brother Frank lived anything but a normal life. Neither liked school, neither wanted to go to school, and both of them were required to go to school because of the family heritage that Julia Reno brought because of her background.
They got a very harsh hand at home from a mother and father figure who really did not get along, and I think that set the stage for dysfunction in their own lives. Not that they can blame that on them per se, because I do think the Reno boys, especially John, I think was more than on the lazy side and looking for the easy way out in a lot of cases.
Crossroads of southern Indiana was the railroad. One was the O&M, that's the Ohio and Mississippi. The other railroad was the Jeffersonville and Indianapolis, the J&I.
As a member of the legislature, Shields knew before most that a new rail line was being planned from Cincinnati to St. Louis and cross Jackson County from east to west near his property. Having bought shares of the new rail line, Shields maneuvered himself into the board of directors for the new Ohio and Mississippi Railroad Company. Shields insisted the route must cross his property.
I mean, if you look at the history, the Shields family and the Reno gang themselves fought constantly. Meaty Shields owned Seymour and established Seymour, and later became a politician and passed some laws that all train tracks had to cross at all the crossings in town. Conveniently, he owned a hotel and a bar and everything at the railroad tracks.
Basically, at that time, railroads could cross east and west, north and south, and they didn't have to to stop as long as there was some sort of navigable way to make sure that they didn't end up hitting each other. But Meade was a clever guy. Reno, I think, was a clever guy. And Meade determined, well, when Rockford is gone, it's destroyed, and the railroads naturally begin shifting their operations to the south, to Seymour, they're going to have to cross around there because that's the only town at this point.
John Seymour was a railroad survey engineer assigned the task to determine the route through rural Jackson County. Shields guaranteed the engineer would have a new town named after him where the rail lines crossed.
The river was always the big deal. You had to get stuff in by river. Rockford had the river. Seymour didn't have the river, the crossing. The town was growing. We got the railroad because it was named after an engineer. That's where Seymour's named after. The engineer, hey, if you make the railroad come through Seymour, we'll name it after you.
What I think is, yes, they had been at odds with each other back to the 1830s when they were arrested for fighting each other in public. But just because you hate another person doesn't mean that you won't work with them if you think it's going to be to your benefit. So I don't think Wilkeson Reno cared one bit whether Rockford was the major center of commerce and finance and information for Jackson County. He wanted land. He wanted power, and land was power back then.
Seymour would end up being the junction of two great railways connecting four large cities: Cincinnati to St. Louis going east and west, and Louisville to Indianapolis going north and south. A series of fires started occurring in Rockford. Some people blame the Renos for starting the fires to buy back the burnt-out land cheaply. Some theorized that the new citizens of Seymour burned down Rockford so everyone would move there.
Residents of the new town wanted to make sure the new town was successful. Burn the old town. And if we have to take a couple of churches out with it, so be it. So those type of dynamics are very interesting. I'm not quick to form a conclusion and blame everything on the Renos, which is, from what I've read in a lot of the books, is the first thing that people jump to.
I think we have had people in this community, honestly, back then that wanted Seymour to be something and Rockford not to be something, and they owned a bunch of ground in Rockford instead. The opportunity of becoming very wealthy.
When capitalism got focused and capital started getting focused with a small group of people, it was taking it from others that were not as successful, meaning the people of Rockford. They drained Rockford dry, basically, is what happened because of the railroad crossing that was acquired by political means. The unintended consequences of that can cause a criminal class to arise. The Renos had a rough way to go.
Having some knowledge of these persons, whose operations have given them such a notoriety, I will give your readers a brief sketch of them. I will commence with Wilkes Reno. The father of the family has lived in Jackson County for over 30 years, and up to 2 years ago, where stolen goods were found in his possession, was considered an honest though eccentric man. About 10 years ago, his family endeavored to have a guardian appointed to him on this ground that he was insane. Failing in this, his wife obtained a divorce from him. There are 5 boys. Frank is the oldest. John was born a year later. A few years later came Simeon, and then Clint, and then William, or he's known as Bill. The very youngest is a sister named Laura. Not much is known about her except she lives with her mother. Of these, Clint is considerably strict, honest, and honorable. Sim and Bill, though nothing is positively known against them, are looked upon with suspicion. Frank and John are known to be safe blowers. They are of medium size, stout built, active, and courageous, with the appearance of the better class of men of their calling. They're kind, generous, and honest in everything but their profession. they would not hesitate to cut the jugular of anyone that would stand between them and their prey.
Frank, being the oldest, certainly had some leadership tendencies. There's no doubt about that. He obviously was also trying to sort of push his own way as early as he could. We know that if he wasn't actually married, he was living with a woman by 1860, when he's still relatively young, that he's running his own business in conjunction with her, a liquor business as a matter of fact. So he seems to have had some smarts.
My impressions, if I saw Frank Reno walking down the street, I think my impression of him would be somewhat sophisticated, somewhat sinister looking, somewhat conniving, somewhat dangerous.
Frank had that leadership, had the age, had the experience to be a leader of an operation like that. We know that there were times where he was called impetuous, where he seemed to have a temper about him, and yet it doesn't seem like it got in the way of his trying to do all of the criminal activities that they were involved in.
And I would be very cautious around a personality like Frank Reno.
John, who is frequently called Jack, seems to have been a typical second son. He was probably struggling a little bit to make his own place in the world.
The day Fort Sumter was fired on, the people went wild with excitement. When the call came for volunteers, my name was 16th on the list. We were sworn in at the old courthouse in Brownstown. One day while riding on horseback in company with Lieutenant George Wallace, he lost his pocketbook containing $400. I was arrested on suspicion of taking it and placed in the guardhouse. I was later found not guilty and returned to duty. John Reno, 1879.
And he was almost always either under guard or in prison some way.
8 months later, I rejoined my company at Cumberland, Maryland, where I took the first life since my enlistment in the Army. The victim was not a Confederate, but a fat hog, fresh pork being a great rarity at that time.
When Frank Reno joined up, he was on a short-term assignment. It was a 3-month enlistment, and it was over and done almost as fast as it started. Nothing happened, nothing went wrong, everything was fine and dandy. But after that point, that was when the Renos decided, you know, there's some money to be made in this. If we join up and then quit, and then rejoin and take our bonus every time, or if we sign up under somebody else's name and take their bonus money, and there was a lot of money in it. People did that quite a bit, and while it was illegal, most of the authorities looked the other way because there was no way to police it.
William joined the Indiana Volunteer Infantry in 1862. The entire regiment was forced to surrender to rebel forces in September of that year, but William was not to be found. He had gone AWOL, perhaps to avoid capture, perhaps to desert.
Yeah, they were down in, I believe it was in a county in Tennessee, near where the troops were in encampment. And I think he was leaving. I don't think he was worried about getting caught. I don't think he was in a battle. I just don't think he had a stomach for battle. And I think he was leaving.
He made his way from Kentucky to Tennessee, away from the fighting, and took refuge with a family there.
And the Cranmore family is the name that I had run across in some of my researches where he had stayed.
with William, you sort of get the feeling that he was just an impulsive youngster, and he met this girl and was smitten and got married strictly for love, or strictly on an emotional basis. And maybe he was the most emotionally honest of the children in that regard. Again, I think that says something about William Reno and what he was like, that maybe that dark stain that covered so much of his older brothers' souls, their lives, had not touched him.
When they got to just out very close to Dayton, Tennessee, William went Reno, met a girl, they shacked up.
What I see is that you had this young kid who probably was pretty good looking, who was wearing a blue uniform, and it was probably a relatively new uniform, not torn up and battered like so many of them were. Maybe he didn't smell quite as bad as some of the other soldiers did, and he caught the fancy of a local girl. She saw somebody and got stars in her eyes and went, wow, and he saw this pretty Southern belle and went, wow, and they clicked. This was a courtship of less than 10 days. This was quick.
Go back or not?
You probably should. You don't want to be a deserter. You know him, right?
I don't know. Will they kill me anyways?
You never know until you go. Plus your brothers, what would they say?
Who knows what my brothers are doing right now?
He would have listened to Mama. He would have listened to Laura. And I think if he had respect for a female, and Frank and John were not the type to typically have respect for females or anybody else, but I think William was brought up with some respect for him. And I think when she said go back, he went back.
Don't ever forget me.
The part that is not understandable, why would a girl raised in the South at Dayton, Tennessee, why would she tell somebody to go back and get an honorable discharge when he was on the other side of the battle fighting against her people? But we have a record that that's exactly what she did.
By the end of the Civil War, Seymour had become a major railway center, while Rockford became a desolated, burnt-out ghost town. The first lot owner in Seymour was Travis Carter. A former Rockford resident, he established the mills there and would build a financial empire. Another leading resident was Jonathan C. Grubb. He opened a mercantile store in Rockford in the 1850s, but by the early 1860s, he relocated to Seymour and opened his store there. Frank, John, and Simeon had returned home as deserters. The brothers moved into the charred, empty buildings that would soon become infested with cutthroats, gamblers, and counterfeiters.
But they came back not very successful. They were not welcomed back with a hero's welcome. All the people that had basically told them to, go fight for the cause with all the speeches before the war, when they came back, they weren't necessarily met with a lot of congratulations and parades and things like that, especially the Renos. They were going to see what they could get back from anybody they could, which I believe once they found some associates in the Civil War, they probably said, well, why don't you come to Jackson County? We've got some places here. There's plenty of money flowing. We've got railroads crossing now.
In 1865, Frank married Sarah Ford, the daughter of a noted lawmaker from nearby Brownstown. She would also play a much bigger part in the family later.
Jasper Monroe was very successful in getting the vigilante movement started by his writings and so forth. He lived on Chestnut Street, which was right next door to a lot of the railroad workers, the German immigrants who had come in. He also felt comfortable with them because after the revolution of 1848 in Germany, they were free thinkers. It was a free thinkers' revolution. He had common connections with them because of his free thinking ideas and so forth.
This guy was an egotist. He was, oh, give me a forum. It doesn't matter if it's in print or speaking, I'll do it. His role was the wordsmith. He would incite people with words, both in print and speaking.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have been infested with a gang of daring, bloody-minded villains. Oh, yeah! So far this year, we have witnessed 35 major robberies, 14 murders. So far, the guilty perpetrators have escaped detection and arrest. We haven't the patience nor the time to hunt up the particulars of the numerous crimes that have been perpetrated here. The people of this place must see the necessity of doing something to redeem its reputation and clear it of these evils. Yeah. The law is inadequate to meet this evil. It's nonsense to depend upon it. A vigilante committee composed of sober and respectable men must be organized.
I'm in. Let's get them.
The hanging of a few of these villains, until they were dead, would show the country that the citizens of this place are not all in league with cutthroats, highwaymen, as they would have the reputation of being. Nothing but lynch law will save the reputation of the place and its citizens, the mass of whom are honest and upright as the citizens of any place, whatever.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
While Monroe became more aggressive with speeches and editorials against them, the Reno gang's criminal enterprise grew.
So we stole into Seymour and shot poor Mr. Kenny. Though he fell on his knees and pleaded for his life. Goodbye, brothers, and all the Reno gang. Me and Frank and William, together we will hang. And goodbye, sister, Laura, true and lovely. Tell everyone that we swung for the first train robbery. For 3 years longer, we lived on steak and brandy, till the Pinkerton agents threw us in this jail. Now I hear the voices of the vigilantes say, let's put the Reno boys on the train to hell. Goodbye, brothers, and all the Reno gang. Me and Frank and William, together we will hang. And goodbye, sister, Laura, true and lovely. Tell everyone that we swung for the first train robbery.
I'm sure you both know.
Yes, we know. You've been speaking out and writing about this plague here in Jackson County for years.
We have got to put an end to the dark cloud that has shrouded our county.
I can't afford the payoffs anymore, gentlemen. No matter how much I pay, I still fear for my family and my business. They're just not safe. God save us.
Mr. Grubb, if your God would allow hundreds of robberies, And 14 murders in the last few months, then you, sir, are a fool.
Enough of your philosophical tirades, Monroe.
Let's get this straight, Monroe. I'm a God-fearing man, and I don't like atheists, let alone working with one or taking orders from one. Since it's all gone to hell around here, I guess I have no choice.
I assume you've heard of the tragedy 4 days ago.
Guess you're talking about that widow Cutler.
We've had so many people killed around here. What makes this so different?
The difference, Mr. Carter, is that death did not come soon enough for this woman that night. Here's a paper coming out tomorrow regarding the brutal rape and murder of that poor widow Cutler.
Good God Almighty.
You're full of it, Monroe.
Believe me, gentlemen, I wish that I was, but Dr. Jones has confirmed it. Raped and strangled. 2 men by the name of Brooks and Talley, surely tied in with the Reno boys. Mr. Grubbs, Mr. Carter, they have the judge and the sheriff in their pockets so deep those men will never come to trial. But the good citizens of this county are ready to take the law into their own hands. A vigilance committee. They want justice, but they need leaders.
What about the rest of those scoundrels? I mean, I still fear for my life. I still fear for my family's life.
It's the damn Renos. They're the ones sending this county to hell. Not worth their salt, the lot of them. They all need to be in the graveyard.
Those Renos probably have hundreds of men. But I tell you, if there's not enough rope inside Jackson County, I'll get more.
We must keep our identity secret for the sake of ourselves and for our families. We must never be identified with this.
We have formed the Jackson County Vigilance Committee.
A few days later, John Brooks and John Talley are arrested for the murder of Marion Cutler. Starting in February, Frank Reno and other gang members went on a crime spree in Iowa. They started with the Harrison County Treasury in Mongolia for $15,000. Then Louisa County Treasury for $9,000. And then on to the Mills County Treasury for another $9,000. And then on to the Howard County Treasury in late March for another $18,000. They were finally arrested in Iowa the next week and put in jail. The jail was so poorly built that one night they were actually able to break the concrete wall of their cell down and escape. The next day, the sheriff came in to see the note Frank had left him in chalk on the wall. April Fools.
It has been written time and time again by the Pinkertons, by the federal government, by others, that Alan Pinkerton, who was on the case at this point, had been hired by the Adams Express to get the Renos and bring them to justice, that he supposedly brought 6 strong agents of his detective agency. They lured John Reno to the railroad depot in Seymour. The train slowly came to a stop, but didn't quite make it, and the 6 men jumped out, grabbed John, threw him on the train, and rushed straight to Missouri. One of the cleverest captures of all time. And it never happened. Because instead, John Reno, after he'd gotten this money, went to Indianapolis, to the Palmer House, the most expensive hotel in town, took his girlfriend / common-law wife, Molly, and lived the high life. I mean, they were blowing money right and left. While they were doing that, they had no idea that they had been fingered for the job. Law officials from Gallatin, Missouri, came over to Indianapolis, met the chief of police and other police officers, marched over to the hotel at night, sent a bellboy to get John. John said, no, leave me alone, I'm busy. Bellboy came back a second time, John blows him off again. The third time, the cops show up. The chief of police knocks on the door and says, John, you're going to come with us. They take him to the Bates House Hotel, just down the block, overnight, and early in the morning before dawn, they get on a train and take him back to Missouri.
On May 22, 1868, the Adams Express Company was robbed again at this location. Marshfield was a watering and refueling station located in Scott County, Indiana. Marshfield was a barren location and located just 17 miles south of the Reno's dwelling. The train came to a stop. The engineer stepped off to oil the engine. He was struck in the head while 4 members of the gang moved quickly to disconnect the engine and express car from the rest of the train. Guns began to fire, but no one was hurt. The Renos gained control of the train and started to speed northward, leaving the rest of the train behind. 3 of the gang broke into the express car and used the butts of their pistols to savagely beat the messenger and threw him off the speeding train. He would later die. They broke open the 3 safes with crowbars and took everything they could. Stopping a mile south of Seymour, they rode off on horses they had waiting for them. In 1873, Jesse James pulled his first train robbery in Iowa and made off with close to $3,000. On this robbery, the Reno gang would ride away with $98,000.
After Marshfield, when the heat is on strongly, the gang more or less split up. You've got some members who decided, for whatever reason, they were going to continue trying to pull jobs in southern Indiana. We know what happened, that they tried attacking a train and robbing it, and there were Pinkerton agents and law enforcement men on board, and they opened up. And as a result, John Moore and Frank Sparks and Volney Elliott, etc., were captured. But none of the Renos were involved in this one, which may be telling unto itself.
Surrounded by darkness, a late-night train carried 3 members of the Reno gang. Charles Roseberry, Frank Sparks, and Val Elliott were being taken under the watchful eye of Pinkerton guards to the Jackson County Jail in Brownstown, Indiana. The engineer could see a red lantern being waved in the distance. The train was brought to a stop. Out of the darkness, more than 150 masked men appeared. A number of the men jumped on the express car and demanded the 3 prisoners. At first, the prisoners had thought they had been rescued. They soon found out that was not the case. The 3 men were readily given over to the masked halters. They were placed in a wagon and transported to a large beech tree nearby. 3 heavy ropes were swung over a large branch.
Come on, boys. Time to meet your maker.
Val Elliott pleaded for his life and asked to speak to his mother.
I need to see my mother. I just want to see my mom.
Her house is right over there. Time's run out.
It would later be found out by the future owners of Elliot's property that $20,000 was buried in the garden. Elliot probably wanted to tell his mother it was there. He was not allowed.
Salus populi suprema lex!
Wagon moved out from under them. The vigilantes stood silently as their bodies jerked and twisted. When the bodies became silent, the vigilantes dispersed into the darkness. The next morning, a German farmer that lived nearby was horrified to look out and see a terrifying sight. The three men with their bodies waving in the breeze. The farmer quickly ran to town to notify the authorities. A great crowd gathered. The coroner was called and deemed the cause of death to be hanging by a rope around the neck, supposedly done by a group of men for robberies the deceased had committed.
Laura's gotten a bad rap over the years. Laura is sometimes confused with a young woman who was a member of an outlaw family in upstate New York that ran rampant between the 1820s and the 1860s. Her name was also Laura, and her brothers were just like the Renos, involved in all kinds of criminal activities. And she rode, apparently occasionally, with the boys. She was a criminal. Laura, there is no evidence that she did anything criminal whatsoever. At the same time, she was very protective of her brothers.
Yes, Laura Ellen Reno was the only sister of the Reno family, and she seemed to be isolated, whether it be through honor amongst the brothers or whether she chose that herself. I think it was a combination of both. I think the only, what I would consider to be regular person in the Reno family.
I think she was very aware of what was going on. She could not have ignored what was going on. The boys were all over the place, and everybody in town knew what was going on. Again, the boys were wild, and they were willing to try a lot of different things. And many of them were terrible acts of barbarity, but you don't really hear about them doing anything against women. And I sort of wonder if they weren't brought up where, okay, they might not listen to mom and they might go a different path, but they still had a certain amount of respect and love for her. And it seems to be that there was also, there had to have been love and respect for Laura on their part, or she wouldn't have stuck up for them as much as she did. When it came time to put them in a jail in the state of Indiana, and they were going to be put in the Lexington jail just near Scottsburg in Scott County, a jail that couldn't have held anybody. It was so rickety at the time. She was the one that made the arrangements to shift them down to New Albany, to a jail that they thought would be secure.
They got out at the train station. The engineer turned the train around, ready for their return trip, and they made their way over to the jail.
There should have been a huge force of guards there to protect them. Instead, you got Luther Chuck Whitten, who's not a real smart guy according to all the descriptions. He may, in fact, have been a simple man.
Then he jumped up and headed for the jail door and was going to try to get inside and lock it before the vigilantes caught him. But as he ran for the door, a couple of them grabbed him and clubbed him in the head and knocked him down. Then they drug him inside the jail, and this is when Sheriff Fullenlove heard the commotion.
When they got to the jail, there was Sheriff Fullenlove, who was not about to turn the prisoners over to them upon their demand.
Sheriff Fullenlove cursed all of them by saying, "Damn all of you for keeping a man trying to do his duty." At that point, he knew it was impossible to convince them not to try to hang the Reno brothers. So what he did is he bolted north towards the north end of the jail, but he only got about 10 feet away from him when one of the vigilantes shot him in the arm.
They find the key to the actual jail part of the building. There's one more guard, only one more guard, and they say, look, you got a choice. You let us in, or once we do get in, and we will get in, we'll hang you first.
It's my job to protect this place.
Open the door, or we're gonna blow you straight to hell. Last chance.
We've already shot the sheriff. Come on in. Have a good time. And so the vigilantes enter in.
When the vigilantes came through the door, there were two stairwells, one on the east side and one on the west side, that led up to the balcony. There was 8 tiers on the bottom row on this side, there were 8 cells on the bottom row here. On the upper deck, or the upper tier, there were 8 more on each side, so that made a total of 32. The first thing they wanted to know where Frank Reno was, and he was in cell number 24. Then they asked the jailer, the guard, Thomas Matthews, where Simeon and William Reno were, and he pointed them out too. So the first thing they did was went up to get Frank Reno out.
And so the vigilantes enter in, go up to the second level where the 4 men are being held, and one by one take them out and throw them over the side with nooses around their neck.
And what in God's name are y'all gonna do with me?
Oh, Lord, not William. William had nothing to do with it. May God have mercy on my soul. Frank!
Point where his feet were touching the floor of the jail. All the reports said that he started to walk around in a circle. The rope kept turning. This was really a ghastly sight, and then he had some kind of a death rattle.
You had William, who was pleading his innocence.
God help me!
He said, "Please protect my poor old father and my sister."
Charlie Anderson, the rope broke the first time, and he asked, please let me pray, and said it was too late for that.
When they put the rope around his neck and flung him off the second tier, the rope broke and he fell to the floor.
And he asked, please let me pray, and said it was too late for that, and they hung him again. This time they just slowly pulled him up.
When it was done, that William and Frank were so close together they were almost touching each other. Feel real good to be back in some nice clothes again. Getting out today. Been in this old jail a little too long. But you know,
There's been a lot of rumors going around about the Reno Brothers. I figure it's high time I set them straight. They weren't no bloodthirsty outlaws killing innocent women and children. They didn't shoot people in the back. In fact, citizens of Jackson County was probably more terrorized by the write-ups in the local paper than what really happened. In fact, the leading citizens of Seymour most certainly organized their deaths, and they did that outside the law. No one was ever investigated or prosecuted for the murders of the Reno gang.